to the September 9th edition of the Global News Review. I'm Patrick Ryan, President of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Today, Ambassador Dick Bowers, Dr. Breck Walker, and I will present the top items in global current events and provide analysis and commentary and take your questions. Before we start, I just wanted to mention a couple of program items. Last night, we had a terrific interview with Dr. Tom Schwartz about his new book on Henry Kissinger. We have a copy right here, and I will also mention that we'd like to have new members join. So this week, and this week only, anyone who joins the World Affairs Council or renews their membership or makes a donation of $100, we will put your name in the hat for a drawing of a copy of this terrific book by Dr. Tom Schwartz. And you can also find the conversation that we had with Dr. Schwartz on our youtube.com/TNWAC channel. Again, I encourage people to become members of the World Affairs Council. That's how we get to do the things that we do for you here on the Global News Review and other programs. Let me mention also that tomorrow we begin our Election 2020 project examining critical global issues to inform the voters before you go to the polls. Tomorrow the program is China, conflict and confrontation or cooperation. Dr. Susan Haynes, Professor Haynes, a member of our board, will be hosting a panel of 5 distinguished speakers to cover everything you need to know about China and China-U.S. relations. That starts at 5:30 p.m. So register now to get in on that program. And you can see on the slide there the other issues. We're covering the globe, looking at the important issues for the United States in coming months as we look to January and whatever administration is taking off from that point. We also have on October 22nd a debate watch party. That's the debate at Belmont University. Belmont is our partner, and we're working with them on this project, Election 2020. So we'll be hosting a debate watch party. Look for that. And then on November 3rd, we will have a election watch party. But in between some terrific programs, we have really an outstanding lineup of distinguished people from around the country and around the world. We have some speakers from the Middle East. So take a look at the calendar. That's at tnwac.org/calendar, and you can get in on those programs. Gentlemen, glad to see you all. Breck, welcome back from your week on the road.
Great to be back. Thanks.
And Dick, if you want to start us off with our topics today.
Well, we've got 3 topics, Pat. One is going to be talking a little bit about the United Nations General Assembly and maybe a little background on the UN in general. And then we're going to go to a very deep dive into a report on China's military power and what is going on and why is it a concern to the United States. And finally, Brexit is back. You've got ad infinitum on your slide. I would say Brexit ad nauseum is probably more appropriate. It just keeps coming back at us. So those are our 3 topics, Patrick and Breck. Let's go.
So I guess I'm responsible for the quiz today, and I want to remind everybody that there's a weekly quiz on the TNWAC website that provides a monthly prize for members of TNWAC. So please access that if you are interested. But today's question on the program is, 8 people have been sentenced in Saudi Arabia in connection with the murder of this journalist, a Saudi citizen who was living and working in self-imposed exile in the United States. And the possible answers are A, Mohammed bin Salman, B is Jamal Khashoggi, C is Abdullah Rabia, and D is Hamad al-Sheikh. So we'll have the answer for you at the end of the program.
All right. Well, off to topic 1, the UN General Assembly. They are about to open their session. Dick, do you want to lead us off on
well,
that?
You know, as I think we all know, out of the ashes of the Second World War, the United Nations was created, and it was out in San Francisco in 1945. And basically, nations chose cooperation over conflict. And today it seems to me that this global cooperation is more important than ever, yet more at risk than when the UN was created some 75 years ago. My view is that we really have no choice but to work together in order to defeat COVID-19, strengthen health systems, avert climate catastrophe, drive out poverty and inequality, and ensure that technology benefits everybody. And the bottom line, make sure we preserve global peace and security. Just when we need it the most, our potential to work together feels, to me, more vulnerable than ever. The United States used to lead all these efforts, and today we have given up voluntarily that leadership role. So let's have a little bit of history here. First session of the UNGA was convened on 10th of January 1946 in the Methodist Central Hall in London and included representatives of 51 nations. The next few annual sessions were held in different cities, number 2 in New York City, number 3 in Paris, and then it moved to its permanent headquarters at the start of its 7th regular annual session in 1952. In December 1988, in order to hear Yasser Arafat, the head of the Palestinian organization, the General Assembly organized its 29th session at the Palace of Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. Today, there are 193 members of the United Nations and in the General Assembly. In addition, there are 2 observer states, the Holy See, the Vatican, and Palestine. So what are the kind of major topics that the UNGA will be dealing with this session, the 75th year of its founding? I think number 1 is COVID-19, and world leaders have been asked to focus speeches on multilateralism in the context of COVID-19 and the impact of the pandemic. Experts are going to be talking about how we should be doing things and what we did or didn't do right. And I think there's got to be a lot of discussions on mobilizing greater resources to tackle the virus in countries with especially marginalized and vulnerable communities. And there will be a lot of calls for equitable access to vaccines, tests, and treatments. So number 2, Sustainable Development Goals. The United Nations has been in the sustainable development business for a number of years, but the pandemic has kind of taken some of the air out of the balloon. There are 17 of these goals, which include such things as no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water, and on it goes. And major progress has been made in those goals in the past years, but it seems to be slowing down a little bit. So they will be focused in the General Assembly on these goals, and the greater involvement and engagement across countries, communities, and sectors will be pushed. Third is climate energy. The economies are taking a hit, but it's not doing much in terms of long-term cleanliness in the atmosphere. Global greenhouse gas levels are higher than ever, and while major international climate summits have been postponed because of the pandemic, the climate emergency will still be a major topic. Number 4, I think the UNGA will be tackling inequality. The pandemic's greatest impact is on those already marginalized, among them people of color, the poor, and girls and women. And the UNGA will take stock of slow progress on gender equality, and I think come up and demand greater impetus in this area. And finally, there'll be quite a bit of celebration about the UN being its 75th anniversary, and there'll be a reflection about how we're doing, where we came from, where we're going, and those kinds of things. So the United Nations is, or the United States, I'm sorry, is one of the UN's most important stakeholders. The UN was created at the initiative of the US after World War II, and Washington provides the largest financial contribution to the UN's overall budget. The U.S. hosts the UN headquarters in New York. The UN Security Council sits at the apex of the 75-year-old rules-based international order, heavily devised, underwritten, and anchored by the United States. So a final important question for other UN members is whether this shift in US global outlook under the Trump administration marks a 4-year aberration from or a new normal for US foreign policy. And I think the outcome of the 2020 presidential election will be fundamental in determining this. So look for a very interesting UNGA, guys.
And Dick, that quotation was from an item written by David Winteray of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I think it's probably largely taken from the speech that President Trump gave at the opening of the UN General Assembly, in which he came out and said that he was not interested in being a globalist, that he was a nationalist, et cetera. So it kind of set the tone for the current administration's relationship with the United Nations and international organizations. And I think this year, with the United States withdrawing from the World Health Organization, that will probably not go unnoticed in the speeches and other presentations at this this upcoming opening of the General Assembly.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the UN, basically the bodies of the UN are the General Assembly, and then there's the Secretariat, which elects the Secretary General, and basically that's the administrative wing to organize and have places to meet and publish documents and things of that sort. The International Court of Justice, which is in The Hague, and those organizations
and
also.
the Security Council.
Well, the Security Council, yeah, I guess I should mention that one, right? Since it's the underpinnings of the US and 4 other countries have veto power in the Security Council, which has 15 members, and the other guys are elected from different parts of around the world. So the specialized agencies are things like the World Health Organization and International Monetary Fund. These are things that are vital for the functioning of the world as we know it. So
right, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is monitoring
right.
The JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, and other nuclear activities around the world. Yeah, you're right. The UN. We don't see a lot of what they're doing around the world because they're involved in so many things.
Well, the World Health
forces,
Organization, I think, is basically the CDC for more than half the countries around the world who don't have the capacity that we have for that kind of medical intervention. So,
Hey,
World
Pat,
Food Program, UNESCO, UNICEF.
Yep.
Hey, Pat, I wanted to jump in just for a second and brag on the UN with some specifics, if that's okay, because I think there are lots of folks in the United States and me from time to time that views the UN as expensive, corrupt, maddeningly bureaucratic, inefficient, overly political, and often ineffective. But the UN
that's a good way to start out with your phrase, Breck.
But the UN, through its history, I was doing a little bit of research on this. Its programs or its staff have won 12 Nobel Peace Prizes. And currently they are supervising, I believe, peacekeeping forces in 14 areas of the world under conflict. As Dick was mentioning in the healthcare area, the UN vaccinates 58% of the world's children in a typical year and has made great strides in its contributions towards reducing child mortality through providing cleaner water, better sanitation, better nutrition, those kinds of things. And it played a huge role in wiping out polio and smallpox and also responding to the HIV AIDS crisis, which is still with us today. And as Dick mentioned, they've played a leading role often in halting the spread of epidemics. And they've been a huge advocate for human rights with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that came out early in its history and that they've used to support children's rights and migrant rights and women's rights. And they've been a very loud and vocal and persuasive advocate in those areas, I think. And people complain about how expensive it is from the U.S. perspective, because we, I think, provide about 20% of the UN budget, which, as I call is about $10 million, which just in perspective is about the cost of what we pay for the U.S. Coast Guard in an annual year. So it, despite the maddening episodes from time to time, it seems to me at least that we're getting a lot of bang for our buck, so to speak. And I end with a quote from former Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, if I'm pronouncing that right, Dick. His quote was, "The UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell." And I like that quote. I think that sums it up pretty well.
That's a good review.
There are a tremendous number of things. You know, just look at the World Food Program. When there's a famine in the Horn of Africa or somewhere else in the world, we see these awful images on TV, but the people who are landing in the C-130s and providing nutrition for people who are about at the end of their well-being, they step in. The refugees, the peacekeepers, you know, if you look at the Gaza Strip, the UN is in there making sure that the Palestinians who are locked into that enclave are taken care of. So I agree with Breck. There's a tremendous amount going on at the UN, and I think the concern that people have about the United Nations is politics. The Security Council sometimes doesn't get things done because there's the veto power of the 5 permanent members: the United States, China, Russia, France, and Great Britain. So if there's a contentious issue that you know, we're at odds with China over, they could veto or we could veto. Frequently, the United States has used the veto to protect Israel from resolutions that would go against their interests. So I think the politics is baked into the formula of the Security Council and the vetoes, and if you look at the composition of the General Assembly, their resolutions are not as binding or as important as the Security Council. So it's politics, it's global politics, but
hey,
yeah.
Can you put that slide up again you had up about the 193 members and breaking them into various regional blocks? Sure. Because I have a question. There's one little black dot down there, if I remember the slide correctly, where it says no group. Who is that? I have no idea. So basically, it's an outlier that's not part of any of the group of African states or Asia Pacific states or East European states.
I would think that's a good question, Dick. I'll have to go back in and do some more research there. Anyway. I would think there'd be more than, you know, that might be the United States or Canada or somebody on the non.
Well, there are some areas.
Non-aligned movement.
Yeah, some that, for example, Taiwan. Taiwan is considered by China to be an integral part of China and therefore is not an independent country and therefore doesn't belong in the United Nations. Greenland has its own parliament, but it's really got a connection to Denmark. So it's not in the United Nations. Same with Bermuda. Well, Bermuda is a crown colony. There are a lot of them left over from the vestiges of the British Empire kind of thing.
Yeah, so, aren't we buying Greenland?
Pardon?
Aren't we buying Greenland?
Well, I think it'd be a good investment, but I don't know. The water is going to be going away because the icebergs are melting, right? So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I think Mr. Trump wanted to buy Greenland from Mark a little while back. But I don't think it went over.
I don't think the Danes are interested in selling.
Probably not. All right, let's move on. We've given our 2 cents on the United Nations. And as a native New Yorker, I can tell you that when the United Nations General Assembly opens, Manhattan traffic, which is normally horrible, becomes just, you know, maybe Dag Hammarskjöld was right. It's on its way to hell. It gets pretty bad in Manhattan with all the VIPs showing up. Okay, on to China and the release of a report by the Pentagon, and this is an annual report that's due to Congress, called the Military and Security Developments involving the People's Republic of China Annual Report to Congress. And this is produced by the Defense Department. And I would commend it to your reading, at least to your browsing. Take a look at you can just Google China military power and it'll be the first thing that comes up. And this document is kind of a derivative of what the Pentagon did back during the Cold War regarding the Soviet Union. In the Reagan administration, you can see Mr. Reagan there with the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. They produced this Soviet military power book every year, and it was spread around the media and the public, and you could find it at military bases and all over the place. They really put a lot into showing how powerful the Soviet military was, and with the demise of the Soviet Union, this went away. And then a few years ago, the Pentagon decided to produce a report on China, and this is actually mandated by Congress that every year the Pentagon produce this report. So what they've done is put together this report on the internet, and you can probably also imagine that there are hard copies being shared around Capitol Hill and elsewhere to show the growing power of the People's Liberation Army. And you know, we would be remiss in not mentioning that China's strategic power is not just invested in its military, but in its economic outreach as well. You know, we've talked here about the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese commercial expansion and building networks and infrastructure across Central Asia and into Africa and Europe, even an Arctic route of the Belt and Road. But this publication looks specifically at their military systems, expansion of their nuclear arsenal, the conventional forces, and so forth. So take a look at it, and in the overview, there's some useful sections on what the strategy of the People's Republic of China is regarding their military strength. And interestingly, there's talk about the national objective of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by the year 2049. And you know, you can trace over the last couple of years, China has exerted its military power, especially in the maritime realm, in the Western Pacific, especially the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. But the report is a useful guide to the Chinese Communist Party's look at foreign policy, the national objectives, what they intend to do with the armed forces. And the Pentagon position is that as of about 2019, the PRC recognized its armed forces should be taking a more active role. And we can see that in the construction of new ships, the outposts in the South China Sea, and so forth. Here you can see a couple of areas where China has rubbed up against its neighbors in Western China along the border with India. And recently we've seen conflicts back and forth. And just this weekend, there was shooting going on back and forth across the border. A few weeks ago, there was a major clash between China and India over that section of their border. So they have territorial disputes with India. They have territorial disputes in the South China Sea, and we've talked about the 9-dash line in the South China Sea, which is the Chinese claim to territorial sovereignty over a number of islands well down into the South China Sea, adjacent to places like Vietnam and the Philippines. And then in the East China Sea, there's a conflict with Japan over the Senkaku Islands, which the Japanese administer, but it's claimed jointly by China and Japan. Interestingly, a couple of years ago, the United States made it clear that the U.S.-Japan Defense Agreement included protection of the claim of Japan on the Senkaku Islands. So that's one more trigger in the Western Pacific. Being a Navy guy, I grabbed a copy of this major naval units chart just to give you an idea of what the Chinese Navy, it's actually called the PLAN, the People's Liberation Army Navy. That probably makes it interesting on Army Navy Day.
I think the Chinese sailors know they're in the Navy. And I don't think there's any confusion with the grunts, so to speak, right?
Yeah, so you can see the major bases along China's eastern coast, and some of the units that are based in that area. And finally, we'll take a look at this slide, which shows the ranges of Chinese strategic weapon systems and the numbers of launchers and missiles they have of the various weapon systems. And just so you might not discern what's going on with that chart on the left, North America is at the top of the screen, upside down, but to show the range rings of the Chinese strategic weapon systems, and 1,300 kilometers covers the entire United States, with the exception of Florida. So Florida, you're okay there, no worries. But you can see the number of various strategic forces. And also, I thought it was important to note that the Chinese defense budget, especially in the last 10 years, has grown continuously, despite a decline in the GDP growth for China, which had been for many years in the 9 to 10% range, and has declined slightly. I think most countries wouldn't mind having a 6% GDP growth, but for China, that indicates a decline. So they're going to have to address their economic issues, and meanwhile, they're continuing to invest in their military. As you can see, in 2019, the investment was approximately $170 billion adjusted for inflation. And that compares to over 700 billion for the United States military. But we operate a worldwide military, not just in the Western Pacific.
I had a Navy question for you.
Yes, sir.
So I see they've got GLICMs, right? Ground launch missiles. Do they have submarine launch ballistic missiles?
Yes, they do. They have several SSBNs, the ballistic missile submarines that are equipped with long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, SLBMs. So and that's like our ballistic missile submarine force, a survivable leg of their triad. They have land-based, air-based, and sea-based strategic weapon systems.
Okay.
Hey, Pat, I have a military question for you, if you don't mind, with a little bit of a prelude. When I read through this document, it reminded me a little bit of the old NSC 68, the National Security Policy document, authored mostly by George Kennan, written back in 1950 and delivered to President Truman. That was an overview of what the DoD and the State Department thought were Soviet intentions going forward, Soviet capabilities and intentions. And those intentions were basically argued to be essentially world domination. And that report sort of sat on the shelf and I don't think had much impact until the Korean War broke out, and where North Korea invaded South Korea with the okay and the support of the Soviet Union, as well as the People's Republic. And then that report was dragged off the shelf and became arguably the game plan for the militarization of the Cold War. So my question is this document kind of like that? And what will be the influence of this document in the coming 3, 4, 5 years?
I don't think this is a binding, this is informational rather than a policy document. Although there are policy implications of some of the statements being made here. And, you know, people are drawing the conclusion that we're now in a new Cold War with China. We're in a confrontational mode, but I don't think the analogy with the Cold War or NSC 68 or the domino theory or those constructs that some of us grew up with apply here. China's economic power probably is the most significant soft power element that they have to offer. A lot of their military expansion in the maritime realm is to counter what they see as the threat to China posed by the United States Seventh Fleet in the Western Pacific, and they want to reinforce their claim in the Spratlys and the Paracels and the rest of the South China Sea. They've militarized those islands. But getting back to the China military power document, I think it's mostly a glossy presentation by the Pentagon, and there are policy implications. Clearly, the United States in this administration has called out China regularly. I think at least once a week, Secretary Pompeo has a statement putting Chinese officials on a sanctions list or condemning this or that activity and referring not to China, but to the Chinese Communist Party. So this is just one more construct within the government's offering of documents justifying U.S. actions vis-a-vis China. But in terms of a National Security Council policy document, I think that's probably a separate realm.
You know, I found it interesting when, you just read the executive summary. If you can get through that. That's only about 10 pages or so long, but I mean, the report itself is voluminous.
Yeah.
But one of the things, for example, that I was struck by is that China's on the move, and they are doing what they need to do in terms of modernizing their Navy, which basically in the past it was just a coastal defense Navy, and now it is starting to become a blue water Navy that can project power around the world. And secondly, China has always been very homebound. China never really tried to establish strategic bases, but now they've got them. And they've got a current base in Djibouti in the Middle East, right, which helps protect their Silk Road initiatives and things of that sort. So it's going to be a different world out there. And I think countries are having to make a deal as China comes in and says, well, we'd like to put a little presence here in Myanmar or other places. So challenges.
Yeah, you're right. They do have bases and access strung across the Indian Ocean. And as I mentioned, the Belt and Road Initiative, they're looking at expanding their trading routes to even the Arctic as the Arctic is opened up for shipping, and they've deployed their military units to the far seas. It is now becoming a blue water Navy. Makes it interesting for U.S. planners to figure out with the current budget constraints and force constraints and how the correlation of forces, the threat mix.
Well, I mean, just one little factoid that I gleaned out of this thing. I mean, shipbuilding. China the PRC has the largest navy in the world now. 350 ships and submarines, according to this report, including 130 major surface combatants. 350 versus the United States, 293. So there's a misbalance now. I mean, we've got, I think you, as a Navy guy, would talk about your aircraft carriers being, game changers as well as a submarine force, but China's moving.
Sure. Yep. Okay. Anything more on China military power? Again, take a look at that document. Just Google China military power. It's a Pentagon report. As Dick mentioned, at least go through the executive summary, the overview. You'll become very familiar with what's going on in the Western Pacific and what the United States is looking at in terms of the position of China militarily. Not the whole story. The economic power of China, again, is important, but this definitely is a piece of the puzzle. Breck, Brexit, ad nauseum. What's your take? Ad nauseum or ad infinitum, or?
Yeah, I think as Pat and Dick, I think that the Brexit story is one foreign policy story that where nothing ever happens, it seems like, and nothing ever ends. But just to recap where we are today, the UK left the EU in an official sense in January 2020. It Brexited. And from that point to the end of this year, there is a transition period where the UK basically abides by most EU rules, while the UK and the EU try and negotiate an exit agreement that will cover relations going forward. And mostly those negotiations are about trade going forward, because the EU, of course, is a free trade area. And if the UK, or now that the UK has exited, it needs to sit down with the EU and decide how they're going to have economic relations together. Now, if an agreement is not reached, then we have what's called probably a hard Brexit. And that means on January 1st, 2021, if there's not an agreement between the EU and the UK, probably World Trade Organization rules would apply, the WTO. And those rules do allow for under certain conditions, certain restraints on trade, including tariffs. And certainly many commentators out there think that a hard Brexit is the worst outcome for the UK in terms of the economic damage that might do. Now, negotiations, this is what's been in the paper in the last week or two, negotiations do not appear to be going so well. From the very beginning, I guess 4 years ago, brinkmanship has been a part of Brexit talks from the very beginning. And in the last few days, there's been a pledge from the Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, to walk away from talks if a deal isn't done by October the 15th. And the UK's chief negotiator said very sincerely, I think, that Britain would be happy to exit without a deal. So the main areas of contention right this second seem to be three. One is fishing rights in UK waters. A second is the question of government subsidies to favored industries, because if the UK and the EU are going to have relatively free trade with one another, the EU does not want the UK to be able to give subsidies to favored industries that would give them a competitive advantage in their relationship with the EU. So that's an issue. And then the third issue is this one that gets the most of the publicity, which is what is going to happen to the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. When that border right now is a border in geographic name only. You can freely drive, walk, run across that border without being stopped. And that was very much a part of the peace understandings and discussions that took place, that there wouldn't be a hard border there, that you wouldn't have to go through customs, that goods wouldn't have to stop and be checked and possibly taxed and so forth. And that's the way it has been with the UK as part of the EU. And of course, the Republic of Ireland is staying with the EU, and the UK now has exited. So the question becomes whether or not that kind of free-flowing border will continue. Now, Boris Johnson and the EU agreed back last October that that would continue to be a free border, and that to the extent that there are customs checks and inspection of goods and so forth, that would take place in the ports of Northern Ireland, and the Northern Ireland government would agree that any goods produced in Northern Ireland that were going to be for export, that it would comply with EU rules in that regard. So it was kind of a fix, so to speak, to keep things as they are at the border. But in the last couple of days, there has been rumors in the newspapers that the UK is going to back away from that and might be wanting to have some sort of border checks. And that would create a huge confrontation, I think, between the EU, the UK, and, well, in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So more to come on that. I might just add, if it's okay, briefly, my thoughts on the question of how big a disaster is Brexit from the UK perspective, and a little historical context may be helpful here. I mean, the story of Europe since World War II has generally been one of economic and political integration. that the EU's earliest beginnings, I think, date back to, and maybe before this, but date back to at least 1952, when 6 countries, France, West Germany, Belgium, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, established a free trade area for a few key resources, but in particular coal, steel, and iron ore, in an effort to jumpstart economic growth in the region. And then that was expanded, that narrow free trade area was expanded to a free trade area encompassing almost all economic activity. And that bloc, that happened in 1957, and that bloc was called the European Economic Community, or the EEC. And that's no tariffs or other barriers to the free flow of goods, and that began to attract other European nations, to the point where then in 1993, the EEC, the Maastricht Treaty was signed, and the EEC became what's called today the European Union. And that treaty was a big move to try and integrate Europe's nations, those who were part of the EU, beyond just economics, to integrate them politically as well, where Europe would all of a sudden become more like the United States of Europe and would have a united foreign policy, common citizenship rights, a common currency, a common perspective on immigration, and so forth. Now today, of the 51 countries in Europe, 28 belong to the EU. And the EU together has a population of something north of 500 million inhabitants, taking all the member countries together, which is the 3rd largest population in the world after China and India. And I think it's fair to say the core beliefs of the EU, why it's there, is that the belief is that countries that trade together, that have strong economic relations, don't go to war against each other. And also that a united Europe is better able to protect its interest globally than a divided Europe. And so the cost of this, though, is to achieve this, each European country had to give up a little bit, and the big question is what's a little bit, but a little bit of their national sovereignty over policy areas, and those areas have evolved over time and tended to increase over time. And throughout Europe, there's a continuing debate over what the EU should be when it grows up, so to speak. Should it be mostly an economic pact? And we've gone way beyond that at this point. Should it be like the United States of Europe? Or should it be something in between? Now, the UK Brexiting has been really highly controversial. And the vast majority, at least as I see it, the vast majority of commentators who are not politicians have suggested that Brexit is very bad for the UK, that the vast majority of UK business leaders, and particularly large company business leaders, for example, 85% or more, wanted to stay in the EU. And it's been portrayed in the press, Brexit, as a politically motivated sort of harebrained scheme driven by anti-immigration zealots. And so there was this internal British politics led to a referendum in 2016. The turnout for the referendum was a high percentage, north of 70%. And the referendum to leave the EU passed narrowly, 52% to 48%. And so Brexit began, and at the end of this year, Brexit will be, in every respect, a reality, it sounds like, one way or the other. But to try and just be a little contrary here and solicit Pat and Dick's comments, I think that there are some reasonable arguments that can be made in support of Brexit from a UK perspective. And I just wanted to lay out 2 or 3 of those and get reaction if I could. Certainly sovereignty is the heart of the issue from the UK perspective, where the EU has authority, and that's in a lot of business regulation and agricultural policy and copyright patent law and immigration. In the areas where the EU has authority, EU rules override national laws. Now, the hot button area in that sovereignty issue was certainly immigration, that pro-Brexiters in the UK want to control their own borders. They want their democracy to decide what the border rules are. And they argue that immigration under the EU has hurt domestic UK workers and has diminished national security. In a similar sovereignty issue, right now the UK government cannot follow its preferred industrial policy. You know, China supports certain industries and certain companies because it wants to be industry leaders in those areas, and they think that's going to benefit China long term. under EU rules, individual European countries cannot do that. So UK can't subsidize without EU approval industries important that it thinks for its own national security, for example. Now, giving up this kind of sovereignty, that might be a good thing if there's considerable economic benefit to the UK, but it's arguable how much economic benefit there is. That British businesses are now saddled with these rules and regulations that are not approved by the British. And that's in the context of the vast majority of small and medium-sized firms in Britain do not trade with Europe. So they're following EU rules, even though they don't export any goods. And further, the EU is a slow-growing market. I don't think anybody thinks that the EU market as a whole is going to grow more than, say, 2% a year. So that becomes a market that is shrinking in some sense as a percentage of overall world trade. And the best future trade opportunities for the UK and for other European nations looking out 10 or 20 years lie outside of Europe. They're the BRIC countries and the developing nations of the world and so forth. And yet under EU rules, the UK cannot sign its own free trade agreements with other nations. It has to be part of an EU trade agreement. And then the last thing is, at the end of the day, if it's true that the UK is able to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU, if it can negotiate a proper agreement, and it's certainly in the interest of all parties to do that, then it's not losing much, the Brexiters, the pro-Brexiters might argue. And for example, Norway and Switzerland are both outside the EU, and their economies are doing just fine, have good trading relationships with the rest of Europe, and so forth. Now, I've searched far and wide for credible folks that I could point to that would back me up here and agree with my opinion. And this is honest, I couldn't find any credible ones, but I did find, well, I shouldn't say that. Well, I've already said it. But I did find three people who do agree with me on this. One is Elizabeth Hurley. One is Elizabeth Hurley, actress, British actress and former girlfriend of Hugh Grant. One is Ringo Starr, who needs no introduction. And the third is President Donald Trump. But I guess I'd leave with this comment that, and there are lots of plenty very cogent, persuasive arguments as to why Brexit is very bad for the UK and certainly for Europe. But just to summarize one, just to mention one that sort of summarizes the gist of all of them, it goes, and this is from some satirist in England, if it ain't broke, don't Brexit.
It ain't broke, don't Brexit. Hey, I have a question about the UK. So there are four theoretically sovereign parts to the United Kingdom, right? You've got Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and England. If this thing keeps
they're not completely they're not sovereign states. They're states in some fashion.
Yes, you're right. I stand corrected. They have a common thing in common, like a queen and parliaments and things of that sort. But will this, are the Scots in particular going to be interested in maybe, heck with it. We don't need to be part of the UK. We're going to become independent and do our own thing.
Well, in the referendum, it's interesting. In the referendum, the Welsh and the English were not overwhelming, but solid majority voters for Brexit. And the Scots and the Northern Ireland were a solid majority against leaving the EU. And certainly one of the downside risk that the UK is running is that this Brexit will cause the Scots to reinvigorate their secession efforts from 3, 4, 5 years ago. Yeah. And this time it may be very much in their economic interest to do that. So good point.
Well,
good summary, Breck.
Taking up your 3 points that Ringo and Mr. Trump agree with you on, I think in my view, what it looked like to me was that that London was perfectly satisfied with the trading arrangement with the rest of their EU partners, but it was driven primarily by this nationalistic drumbeat that stemmed from immigration. you know, we've had open borders in the EU countries, and were a lot of they weren't immigrants. They were labor from Poland and other newly acquired EU nationalities, that Italy and Spain and others that were flooding the British job market. And after the 2008 global recession, people in the UK looked around and said, hey, you know, these industries that we had that British young men and women could grow up and get jobs in are now being taken over by Poles and Spaniards and Italians and Greeks and so forth. And then there was the influx of refugees, and after the Arab Spring, into Europe, and the British did their best to hold off some of those, but there were flotillas of refugees. So it became a very public issue, and there was a lot of stirring going on in the UK about doing something about it. And to be fair, there were concerns about the overreach of the European Parliament into British affairs. But David Cameron, when he called the referendum, believed that it would be roundly defeated. Be careful what you wish for, you just might get it. It turns out that Nigel Farage and I think Boris Johnson at the end got on board the bus there. Literally on the bus, they were riding around in a bus with the NIH, the National Institute of Health, banners on the buses, and really made a big publicity stunt out of the whole bit. But I think at its core, Brexit stemmed from, as you mentioned, Breck, the immigration piece, and the economics. So it was just kind of a tag along.
So I have a question about what happens if basically the border stays open between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Can basically Northern Ireland just send stuff down into the Republic of Ireland, and then off it goes to be sold in Poland, and you know, or you know, what's going to happen? Are they going to put it out in the Irish Sea? Are they going to intercept anything leaving to going towards Europe, kind of thing?
Yeah, as Breck mentioned, that seems to be the most highly publicized issue, because that was for a long time, and this is Theresa May on the right, the prime minister who, after Cameron left post-referendum, she tried to pick up the pieces. But the main deal was called the backstop, and as you mentioned, it was designed to keep the border open between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and that's complicated by the troubles, the Irish Republican Army battles with the Ulster loyalists. You know, this incipient war going back and forth for decades. That was resolved, and part of that resolution was this border, which facilitated trade. And the UK acknowledged that, and they developed this recipe, as Breck said, where goods would be inspected, because there needed to be some division between the United Kingdom and the EU post-Brexit. And the idea was that the Irish Sea would be the boundary between the two. And now this new legislation introduced this week by the British government seems to be crashing that deal. So I think that's what's leading to the potential of, as Breck called it, a hard Brexit. We're running along on time here, but let me mention one more component. You know, Breck, you gave a great overview of how the EU came to be out of the EEC, et cetera. But there are a couple of other treaties that went into effect that impact a lot of this conversation. One of them is the Schengen Agreement, which Schengen is Old Town in Luxembourg. And in 1985, the Schengen countries, and not all of the EU countries, are in the Schengen Agreement. But the Schengen Agreement basically opened the borders, literally opened the borders between countries. And you guys have probably driven around Europe. You get to the border between the Netherlands and Belgium, and there's a little blue sign with stars on it, and it says Belgium. And that's the only way you know that you've just left one country and entered another. I mean, the signage is if you drive from Texas into New Mexico, there's a gigantic sign and there's no mistaking you're now in a different state. But in Europe, you drive across borders and it's just, you know, fuzzy. So it'll be interesting to see what happens between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland.
Yeah.
Now that London is, Breck, would you say they're reneging on the deal?
Well, I guess I'd say it's too early to tell, but rumors are that that might be happening. I guess we'll know in the next day or two.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that'll cause a brouhaha for sure.
You know, I remember about a year and a half ago, I went from Paris to Hamburg, and as we got to the border, and the train just kept, I guess it stopped, and a guy got on, and he kind of walked down the aisle and looked at people. So maybe it's, you know, racial profiling or whatever it is here, but you know, nobody asked for the passport. Nobody, you know, you just going on your own. As you say, the borders are open.
Quick story from back in the day when I was stationed in Naples, Italy at a submarine headquarters. The last visit of the USS Nautilus to the Mediterranean, that's how long ago this was. A young sailor took leave in Europe and he traveled around. And back in the day, you could use your leave papers and your military ID card to get from one country to another. And he was on a train in Germany and he wanted to go visit Berlin. And he didn't realize that it was surrounded by East Germany, which was not a NATO country, and he got to the border and a Soviet guard pulled him off the train and they held on to him. He was a reactor operator on the Nautilus. So they hung on to him for a couple of weeks and nobody knew what had happened to him. And then he turned up at Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin. So, you know,
so that there wasn't a guy named Ryan, was he?
No. I've done so.
We used to play all those games, Pat. I mean, when I would go from West Germany to Berlin, you know, you'd get to the border and the Vopos, the East German, you know, security police guys would stop you, and you would leave your windows up, show them the outside cover of your passport, and he would just sort of wave you through, and then you'd stop again, and a Soviet soldier or customs guy would come out and actually, you know, log you in and send you on your way. So we did not recognize the juridical status of the East German authorities. So.
And now you just kind of go all over the place at will. But we'll see if there's going to be a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Interesting developments. Well, gentlemen, a terrific news review. I think we've shown the light on a few issues here. The UN General Assembly is opening up, and we know more about that. We're more conscious that China is expanding its military reach. And thanks to Breck, we now have an idea of what's going on with Brexit. And I'll come down on the side of ad nauseum. So let's close it out. We have our question of the week answer, and Breck, if you've mastered the pronunciation.
Oh, sure. No, the answer to our question about which Saudi Arabian was murdered, that they had the sentencing of the culprits or the alleged culprits this week. The answer is B, Jamal Khashoggi. And Pat, if you don't mind me just saying very quickly, Ringo, my now new affiliation with Ringo Starr reminds me of the story that John Lennon, in one of the greatest put-downs of all time, John Lennon was asked one time by a reporter, is Ringo Starr the best drummer in the world? And John Lennon replied, he's not even the best drummer in the Beatles.
Hey, a quick footnote for me, the Belcourt Theater, which is, you know, the artsy-fartsy theater here in Nashville that shows all these good things. You really, they had a hard time because of COVID, so they have turned their parking lot into a drive-in theater. And so last Saturday night, my wife Kay and I got in our car and drove, and the reason I'm mentioning this is the movie was The Yellow Submarine. So
all right.
all over the place.
All right.
We'll see you next week, guys.
One last plug here. Again, let me remind everybody that we're always open for People that become members, we encourage you to become a member or make a gift to the World Affairs Council. That's how we keep things moving along. And just a reminder, anybody becomes a member or renews or makes a gift of $100 this week, they'll be in the drawing for a copy of Dr. Thomas Schwartz's great new book, Henry Kissinger and American Power. So look for that. Gentlemen, thank you very much as always. Another great Wednesday afternoon, and we'll be back next week. Again, take a look at election 2020. Tomorrow night, China. Dr. Susan Haynes will have a great panel, and don't miss that. That's it for us, and we will see everyone next week.